Hello MouseWorks fans, and welcome to another edition of New Tool. And for this episode I'm actually using new equipment, so hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer of an image, and hopefully you'll be able to see a few things better. And for this episode I'm going to be showing a few tricks for soldering brass, so like photo etched and things like that. And I'm going to review a soldering mat that I bought off of Amazon and show you what it's all about. So let's get to it. Okay, for this little tutorial I'm going to be using a few items. This is the mat I was telling you about that I bought off of Amazon. It was specifically for soldering, and it's supposed to withstand 925 degree heat. And I'll show you how it works. This is the solder I'm going to be using. It's rosin core, and it's 6236. You can do other combinations of the solder. 6040 is one of the more common ones, but this is one that I've been using, works pretty good. And I'm going to be using flux, a paste flux, and this stuff can come in liquid or paste, but paste is easier for doing photo etch parts because it stays in place. But this is a definite must to do any soldering. So alright, let me show you what I have for the soldering equipment. Okay, this is the soldering equipment that I use. This is a Weller soldering iron, and it has a station, so there's a temperature control. I recommend, if you're going to be really seriously doing any kind of soldering, to buy a soldering iron with a station. It keeps the temperature more consistent and works much better. Trying to use a soldering iron that just plugs into the wall is going to be very frustrating. So right here is the actual iron itself, and you can see it's a really very fine tip. You can do different types of tips on these, but this one is what we're going to be using. And this little unit here, this is a cleaner. Now most soldering irons come with a sponge to wipe it off, the solder and the gunk off. You wet the sponge and clean off of that. The problem is it shocks the iron, which does get the solder off, but it can really mess up your tip. This is much better. This is kind of like a brass Brillo pad. It's basically what you do is you plunge the hot iron in here, and it cleans the tip off. The extra solder and gunk will get stuck to this wiry stuff and stay on there instead of your iron. So we'll show you how to use that. So different temperatures work for different things. I tend to like to use the 70 setting, which is about 700 degrees. A lot of these smaller irons do not go that high, the ones that just plug in, so best to get a good one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this on. You can see the little light comes on. Now that light will start flashing when it gets up to temperature, and it does not take too long to do that. So we'll let that heat up and we'll get started on soldering. Okay, so the light is flashing or flickering, showing it's at temperature. Now this iron already has some solder on it that basically sealed in the tip. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plunge it into the coil, and it will clean it up. You can see some smoke coming off of it. And now the tip is completely clean and ready for soldering. Again, 700 degrees. And I will show you how we solder. Okay, so this mat is supposed to be through 925 degrees temperature and won't melt or warp or anything like that. So I wasn't too sure about that because that's pretty hot. But when I got it in and started using it, here's the iron, and it's again at 700 degrees. And check this out. There's no, let me get a tight shot here. It is not melting the rubber. It is not scarring the rubber. It's just leaving a little residue of the solder. So yeah, that's pretty impressive that takes the heat. There are other mats out there. Just make sure that they're rated for the high temperature. You can even put some solder on the iron. We'll melt some here, and we'll put it on the mat. You can see there's a little blob of solder. Look at that, it doesn't even stick to it or anything. So as a review of these mats, thumbs up. That is a very good system indeed. So that's what we're going to use to solder a piece of brass. Okay, so now I've got a piece of brass here that I've bent, and I put it in this little clamp here. It's called a extra hands, just so it holds it tight to where it is. Most times you're going to be folding photo etched and it'll hold by itself from the fold. But this is just a little insurance just to make sure that it holds tight. And then I'm going to solder it to this bottom piece here. So what we'll do is we'll get it tight against there just by pressing it there. Okay. Now I'm going to use this paste flux. And it's pretty nasty looking stuff. Sometimes it's a little lighter than that. But it's, I've used these little tiny micro brushes to apply it. You don't need much of this stuff. And what happens is this cleans the surface of what you're soldering. So it gets a good solder joint. And it also, the solder will follow this stuff. So wherever you put this stuff, the solder is going to go. So we're going to put it right in that groove, right there. Okay. And then I'm going to take the solder and the soldering iron. And now, what I like to do if it's a small part is I will pick up the solder with the soldering iron on the tip and then place it on here. And you'll see it track down all the way wherever this flux is. So we'll melt some solder to it. Okay. And you'll hear it sizzle. And it'll just track wherever that flux is. There we go. Okay. Now there's a little bobble here that I made. So what I'm going to do is you can try to pick it up with a soldering iron and smooth it out. But there's a better way to actually clean it with a Dremel tool. So we'll show you how that works up next. So now you can see that it's soldered and it's all tight on there. I mean, it's not going anywhere. Much stronger than super glue. And there's a little bit of bumps in here. Most times, once you get good at it, you can get it pretty smooth. But if you want this to be the outside of the item that you're going to be painting, you want to smooth that down. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this Dremel with a wire brush tip. And we're going to set it on low setting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush the solder. And this will polish out any of the solder bumps, but it does not eat into the brass. Of course, unless you really press on it, then it might eat into the brass. But solder being softer than the brass, it'll actually polish that down first. Speed it up a little bit. Now this does heat up. This heats up the brass, so be careful of your fingers. Okay, and as you can hopefully see, it's starting to polish out the actual joint, and it will actually smooth down to the point where it will just fill that seam there completely, and when you paint it, you will not see any of it. You can kind of see where those bumps were. They're all now polished out right there. So anyways, that's some tips on doing some soldering. I might do a little tutorial later. Just let me know what kind of other tips you want to see. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. And thanks for watching. Oh, and one last thing, a little tip about solder iron care. This is actually how you take care of your soldering iron after you're done using it. So what I will do is I will plunge it into the wire to clean it off. And then I put it directly into the flux, which burns and cleans the tip, and then plunge it again. Do this a couple times. And that gets the tip perfectly clean. And then what we're going to do to keep this from corroding while it's in storage is we're just going to tin it with a little bit of solder to cap that end, and then when we shut it off, that solidifies and makes a metal cap. And then when you start over again, you heat it up, pull that off, and you're ready to go.